Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Digby James Wren, and I'm here to share with you a new collaborative effort between some of the most influential media commentators on geopolitics in the world today. You've seen them on your screens, YouTube and all other platforms, Twitter, social media everywhere, Facebook and so forth. And amongst those is my good friend Warwick Powell, who's organized this collaborative effort, and Aina Tangen, Arnaud Bertrand, and others. And collectively, we've presented this program to discuss a multipolar peace. Working towards peace, I think, is probably the most important goal for anybody working in politics today. And we see a situation where there are two wars, one in the Ukraine, one with Israel against Gaza, and a third front along the periphery of China in Taiwan and the South China Sea, for example. The United States is reticent and doing everything it can to maintain hegemony, to keep the unipolar moment after the fall of the Soviet Union going forever. But that makes up only 5% of the world's population. And today we can see that right across the world, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, all joining together. And today they have a platform, the Belt and Road Initiative, which allows them to use the ports and infrastructure constructed all across the world and the superstructure of digital services, of cross-border transactions and digital currencies to de-dollarize, to take away the one thing that maintains this dream of unipolarity, continuing and permanent polarity by the Americans, which is the power of their dollar. But we're going to discuss all these questions together tonight and go into different perspectives, European perspectives, American perspectives, Asian perspectives, Australian perspectives. I personally live here in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, which was a very fraught country. Only 40 years ago at year zero with the Khmer Rouge, which has had a renaissance more recently, and which also dreams of joining a multipolar world, a world where ASEAN as a bloc is secure and not being consistently and constantly interfered with by external powers, specifically the United States and Europe and its allies in Europe, the same allies in Europe that are conducting the war in Ukraine and turning a blind eye to Israel's aggression against Gaza. This situation, this move towards polarity, multipolarity, is not a new idea, but today it's taken shape in the form of the BRICS Plus, the non-aligned movement, the Bandung Conference, the non-aligned movement, and it's been able to harness the economic power of China to give it a model and to build a international superstructure on a substructure of infrastructure. So that's a very confusing way to say it, but substructure of ports, pipelines, rail, roads, you name it, anything that connects one country to another, people to people, cities to cities, countries to countries, and then a superstructure of services, of cross-border transactions, of digital services, legal services, accounting services, all the services that the United States basically controls today is slowly being eroded by the global majority as they have access that they've never had before. And this is powering the new multipolarity. So tonight we're going to discuss this in depth. This was pre-recorded this morning, but once again I want to say thank you to Warwick Powell for organising this, and we look forward, all of us look forward, we all expressed our desire to be able to collaborate more and to give voice to the deep desire by the great global majority for a peaceful world where the material well-being of people is the top priority of all governments, where cooperation is the primary means of solving disputes, progressing, looking after climate change, maintaining stability, political and economic stability. And so I hope you enjoy this emission, and it's my great pleasure to be part of that. Thank you very much.
And we're recording.
All right. Well, welcome to the show. Today's show is quite a special event, quite unique in many ways, because it brings together for, I think, the first time ever, a cross-section of independent media personalities and voices from across a number of time zones to share their perspectives on the events that are taking place in the world today. Someone once said that we can have decades without anything happening, but sometimes in 1 week it feels like we have decades happening. And over the course of the past year or more, I think we've had many, many decades happening. So much so that even in the last fortnight, we've had a couple of very important events that I think bookend the developments that are taking place in the world. And they are, of course, the presidential debate in the United States, the celebrations of 70 years since the pronouncements of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. We've just seen the conclusion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Kazakhstan, in Astana. And next week, we will have a meeting of NATO in Washington to celebrate its 75th anniversary. These are significant events impacting the world. Today, we have a very significant panel, and they are in no particular order. Pascal Lottaz. Pascal is a professor teaching and researching in Japan in the area of neutrality studies. We have Jerry Gray, who is an independent media commentator based in Zhongshan in China. David Wallalu, who has just celebrated the 4th of July in Texas with a couple of barbecues. Congratulations. Jeff Rich from Australia. Arnaud Bertrand, a global traveller, but I think based in Southeast Asia these days. Anna Tangen, a long-term resident of Beijing and an American who has become, I think, a feature of a lot of the commentary screens that you'll see around the world. John Pang, a former advisor to the Malaysian government and a research academic in China these days. S.L. Kanthan from Geopolitics Demystified, based from India with some very unique perspectives. And I think I have got everybody at this stage. We may have a couple of others joining us.
Digby.
And who could forget Digby? My apologies, Digby. Digby, my old friend from Australia, who is now an advisor to the Cambodian government and is a international relations scholar based out of the Royal Academy of Cambodia. So welcome, everybody. We may have a couple of stragglers coming along. Time zones have made this a very challenging but an interesting process. Look, we might get stuck into this. And I wanted to kick this conversation off, not so much with the debate in America, but perhaps start this reflection by understanding what happened in Beijing last week in terms of the congregation there that celebrated the 70th anniversary of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And Arnaud, you were there in the Great Hall of the People when that event happened. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so actually, it's not known by a lot of people that China has those 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which date back from an agreement that they had with India 70 years ago, and which have been basically the cardinal principles of its foreign policy since. So, one of them is, for instance, that they refuse to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. They favor, diplomacy instead of conflict. They they don't push for their own ideology, instead, accepting the existence of different ideologies out there, and so on and so forth. And so they just celebrated the 70 years in Beijing. I was there. There were actually quite a lot of very senior attendees. Of course, President Xi Jinping was there with much of the Politburo. There was also Dominique de Villepin, who I admire a lot, one of our last remaining statesmen in France. Of course, the former French Prime Minister, who famously said no to the Iraq War at the UN. He also made a beautiful speech there after Xi Jinping on the importance of peaceful coexistence. And basically what we're seeing is that, the way China is understanding the moment that we're at, and which I think is correct, is that we basically have the choice between, bloc confrontation, like essentially a new Cold War, and peaceful coexistence. And of course, China is arguing for peaceful coexistence because the alternative is just nonsense. Basically, China is such a different country to the Soviet Union that it's just unthinkable that a new Cold War would ultimately have, like Americans like to imagine, the same outcome as the first one. And I think most realistic thinkers also think that there is no alternative to coexistence. So basically, from China's viewpoint, the main challenge is how do you make the West, and particularly Americans, come to grasp with that, understand that there is no point. It's a dead end to try to restore unipolarity, hegemony, and so on. Let's accept each other simply, and let's live in a world where we peacefully coexist.
David, you're in the United States and you've spent a good part of your professional life in Washington. You've also watched, obviously, last week, the presidential debate, which took place one day before this event in Beijing that Arnaud has described for us. What's the reactions from Washington at the moment around these issues? And how do you see the contrast between the debate and the aftermath of this debate, and what some of these issues that Arnaud described are taking place, emerging out of this summit in Beijing?
Well, the assessment here in the United States is that the masses, the population, is so sort of angry at where Washington is, and this debate, which demonstrated the failure of the leadership in the United States. Now, you get two sides or two faces of the same coin. Biden is no different than Trump, and Trump is no different than Biden. Both of them have no clue as to where the rest of the world is headed. A little long that during the debate itself, it was nothing of substance. In other words, what Americans were waiting to hear, are we going to hear anything of substance that can move us in the right direction? Well, all we heard was nothing but insults. And that in itself, personally, I see it as a failure of the lack of having a strategy, the lack of having an understanding of this multipolar order that is now upon us. Of course, Washington is in denial about this reality, but the world is moving forward, whether the United States likes it or not. We're still here in the US wondering what's wrong with the American government that is embarking on a failed policies. I mean, we are already witnessing now where the next sort of a front of conflict is headed towards once the dust settles on Ukraine. And personally, as one who worked in Washington, as an international security analyst, I was in the military, I was in some high ranking within the government agencies. I just don't see this is going the right direction, but we don't have any leaders, because in America, we suffer from leadership deficiency. On the other hand, the events that's taking place around the world, from the 70th anniversary in China, the SCO summit, the upcoming NATO, all this highlights to us the challenges that we are facing. And this is what I applaud you, Warwick, for embarking on something like this that can at least pave the conversation towards a peaceful coexistence instead of just pushing this narrative for more tensions.
Look, thanks, David. The one of the interesting features of this global conversation is from here in Asia, we often scratch our heads and wonder why it is that the US, I guess, pursues what it does, but also reflects a lot on perhaps some long-standing philosophical differences of approaches to the world. John, I mean, you're looking at this currently from China, but really from a broader Asian perspective. Have you got any thoughts on firstly the principles, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and also perhaps reflecting a little bit on David's observations?
Thank you. The 5. I'd like to elaborate a little bit on Arnaud's excellent description of the 5 principles. Yes, they originated in actually agreements between China, India, and Myanmar, but subsequently they were then adopted at the Bandung Conference. So these 5 principles are not just about China. They're also taken up in Indian foreign policy. They're sort of keystone of Indian foreign policy. The Sanskrit term, I think, is Panchsil, right? In Indonesian, it would be like Pancasila in terms of foreign policy. So they're absolutely fundamental. They, in turn, are sort of concretizations of the principles of the UN Charter. Now, in that sense, they very much embody that spirit and the implications of the UN Charter. But historically, I mean, let me just go on. After Bandung, they were then adopted by the non-aligned movement, right? And then which is at some point 77 countries and so on. But they represent an earlier attempt, which we should take cognizance of today, to secure in their relationships with one another a kind of world order or principle of order, which is very different from that of the Cold War protagonists. Or in today's terms, that would be an alternative principle for ordering international relations to that of the West, to that of the so-called rules-based order. So they're really, really important in that regard. And I think it was wonderful and exactly right that they were articulated again in Beijing. And next year is the anniversary of the Bandung Conference as well. So from an ASEAN, a Southeast Asian perspective, and also one of the global South, because the Bandung Conference united not just Southeast Asia, China, India, but also African countries. This is really something to watch, and the principles there are really important at a time when we struggling, right, to understand what comes next, what comes after this unipolar order. I think Pascal, I've been listening to your wonderful channel, would have a lot to say about this. Especially the principles of it has a lot. There's a lot of connection with principles of neutrality, for example. But these principles, I think, are important to enunciate once again today, and maybe they're quite relevant to our conversation. Yeah, absolutely. I think ASEAN would be very good for pushing it. ASEAN would be an important place to secure this. Now, ASEAN is increasingly important now. It's the China's largest trading partner. It's often overlooked because it's been a zone of peace, but it's turning out, as you know, into a kind of arena of conflict, a battleground right now. So if there's going to be conflict triggered in East Asia, it might not be in Taiwan. It might not be that far north. It might be in the South China Sea, right, with one of the ASEAN countries. So and of course the principle of everything that ASEAN stands for is being sort of violated by that country right now.
Look, we might come back to ASEAN a little bit later on in this discussion, because I think that there is an important set of issues around how neutrality and the collective or the collaborative ethos and the consensus-driven ethos that ASEAN has been founded on may provide us with some clues as to what a multipolar world could begin to look like. But I might just throw over to SL in India at the moment on two fronts. One is to just elaborate a little bit more the Indian sensibilities and involvement historically in the promotions of the principles of peaceful coexistence. But also I wanted to draw now into some reflections on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that just took place. And you wrote a great piece concerning that the other day, and whether there are any linkages, if you will, between the principles of peaceful coexistence and the kinds of things that are now on the agenda coming out of the SCO.
Yeah, so India is kind of struggling to find the perfect position and strategy. On one hand, if you look at the elites, the think tanks, the media, and so on, they are very, very pro-US. And a lot of the think tanks in India are actually funded by, like, say, Bill Gates foundations and other, the Atlantic Council and so on. So there's a lot of bias. And the China thing, that has been a problem for maybe like a decade or so. Basically, the US is trying to use India to contain China, and is also to split or to spoil the Asian century, because from the US point of view, the biggest, the danger or the threat to the American century is going to be the rise of Asia, and worse, the rise of Eurasia. Because if you think of a situation where Russia, the rest of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, if they all coexist and if they all work together, then the relevance of the US, really disappears. What is there for the US to offer afterwards? So that's why they are doing all sorts of the divide and rule, Russia versus Europe. And now they're trying to bring NATO into Asia. They're working on that. So it's a very dangerous situation. And for India, I think that, we have two groups within the Modi government. One keeps talking about the multipolar world, and they understand that we cannot be dependent on the US for too long. And then the other group is the one that is totally brainwashed by the Western organizations. They work for the IMF, the World Bank. They go to the US to study, and they send the kids to the US. And if you look at the mainstream media in India, they don't like to think. They just parrot all the Western American talking points. So it's a struggle. But I think maybe I'm a bit too optimistic, but I think in the third term, Modi is going to hold out the olive leaf or the branch to Xi Jinping, and things between India and China are going to get better. So the key, I think, is the BRICS expansion and the de-dollarization. Because if you cannot de-dollarize, okay, then you cannot do anything about, the American empire. So that is the strength and the weak. The Achilles heel of the U.S. is the dollar. So once you weaken the dollar, once you let the U.S. know that the rest of the world can operate outside the dollar system and outside the SWIFT system, that will be a sort of the big moment, that'll be the historic shift, and there will be a seismic change in the global geopolitics.
I read overnight that the statement coming out of the SCO meetings actually identified the need for the member organizations, and perhaps even extending to the dialogue partners, to strengthen and develop national currency-based transactions. Do you see the SCO together with BRICS as really the cornerstones of this process, or the institutionalization of de-dollarization?
Yeah, absolutely. Where else can they go? And they're working on a lot of small projects, and I don't know why it's taking so long, So, so when I had you on Spaces, Professor Powell, you talked about the M Bridge, a system that China is working on. And I don't know why they're taking so many years and adding just one country at a time. That needs to accelerate. So if something like the M Bridge and the grain system, so they're saying now the BRICS countries are working on the grain system that we will see by the end of this year. And that will allow the BRICS countries, which represent like 40% of the global wheat production, 50-60% of the rice production, and so on. So then they can use the grain system for trading with local currencies, pricing them in something that is outside the dollar or the euro. So it really boils down to the technology. If you can create a blockchain system, the distributed ledger system, and just make it easier for countries to trade, that would be logical, and as well as what we really need, the fundamental first step we need to take for, I would say freedom, that would be like the true, the democratization of global finance.
I might just grab Ina here, and then I'll come to you, Digby, because over the last 24 hours as well, there were some developments in terms of RMB settlements in Cambodia. And I think that that's, again, clearly part and parcel of this process of incremental currency multipolarity. But Ina, we've discussed on many occasions these challenges, both technological, institutional, and the impacts on global markets as far as the pace and the breadth of de-dollarization. What are your thoughts on this unfolding process?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with so many interesting people. I've read your pieces, and I admire you all personally. I think I have a slightly different view of the world, which is simply you have to recognize where you are. And you don't have a choice of when you're born, but you do have a choice of what you do. You do not have a choice about the circumstances you're born into. Right now, we're in a situation where you have an empire, the U.S., You can call it an empire. It's better than calling it a rogue state. That is hopefully going to transition into something more civilized. That versus India and China, which are civilization states, in the sense that they're much more concerned about where their borders are, protecting them, and also, how to deal with your internal economic and political realities. So against this background, the U.S. has been an expansive power, following on the colonial past, and we're really struggling with how we transition, or even if we should. I mean, all of our efforts right now are to maintain our hegemony. When you start talking about the dollar, I agree with SL. This is a situation where it is actually not being driven outside. It's being driven internally by the U.S. By weaponizing something we promised not to do. But, like most of our promises, those promises are only good for the moment. As soon as we need to change, or we don't want to adhere to them, we go past that. And then, once again, this is the kind of Genghis Khan approach to life. You take what you want, you don't justify it. You mumble something about if you hadn't done terrible things, God wouldn't have sent me here to punish you. And this is kind of become a feature. In terms of how it all turns out, I agree that the U.S. is on the downslide in terms of global recognition. It's going to affect the dollar. I wouldn't be so hopeful that it happens quickly. The U.S. is a large part of the global demand. If that goes away, we're all going to experience a massive depression, not recession. And Europe is ailing. So you have the traditional powers who rose over the last, 350, 400 years in decline. You have a global South and Central Asia, which is on the upswing, and they're not, they don't want to choose sides. What they want to do is remain neutral, pursue their own interests, not be part of one bloc or another, except to the extent that it benefits them in trade. And you see this clearly in the SCO and Astana. What was going on there? You have Xi Jinping taking the old idea of the non-aligned movement, which were 5 principles, were then expanded to 10 during the Bandung, and he wants to push it back down to 3. I think for a number of reasons. To make it more clear, easier to sell 3 points as opposed to 10 or 5. And it's these initiatives about security, development, and civilization. So he's trying to get his message across. There are alternatives. He's not asking countries to join China at the exclusion of the U.S. We see that quite clearly when you start looking at areas like the Maldives. There's cooperation, but you don't see Beijing saying, if you talk to Washington, it's done. That would be kind of our role. You see Blinken making a last moment grab to retain some sort of influence there by promising a couple of $1 million for this and that, and giving some old patrol boats, etc. Typical of our response. This is a nation that is the lowest lying country in the world that is afraid of climate change. And we said, well, what you need is some military equipment to protect you. So against this backdrop, currency, trade, etc., these are things that are going to continue to be in flux. China can offer an alternative system, but it cannot bear the burden of the U.S., and they don't want to, as far as I can see, take on this kind of idea of the world currency. I think they'd like to shuffle that off to a basket of currencies that would be much easier to deal with. You still have the economic problem, how you come up with the one value to measure things against. That could be the dollar for a while, but the volatility that was mentioned, SL, if you're correct, and I would agree with you, the dollar's fall could result in tremendous economic dislocation as U.S. dollar people start to sell U.S. dollars as the yields go down, hot money flows are reversed. already you see the banks, central banks of the world are at some of their lowest points ever. And those with the most exposure, like Japan, et cetera, aren't very solidified. So I've gone on to quite a moment. I look at this as in terms of, as you can guess, macro point of view. We are in the midst of change. The question is how we manage it.
Digby, you're at the coalface in Cambodia of many of the intersection points of the elements that Ina described at both a macro level, but also in terms of how a small developing country seeks to navigate a complex geopolitical environment. So yesterday or the day before, I saw reported on one of your substacks, actually, that Oriental Bank in Phnom Penh has kicked off a facility enabling RMB trade settlements. What else is happening in Cambodia in terms of how a small nation is navigating these political and technological and climate and ultimately economic development imperatives?
Well, I thank you very much for allowing me to join such an erudite group. But I'd probably go back to 2014 when the current government or party that controls the government was almost overthrown in a color revolution just at the same time as Ukraine was. And that failed. And since then, the government has been able to stabilize and has seen roughly 10 years of about 7.7% annual GDP growth, which is a phenomenal result. And that continues. But what's happened is that the government has now transitioned into a much younger, much more technocratic, educated group of people who, non-revolutionary, who, didn't have to fight against the Khmer Rouge or against anybody else. And so they are technocrats. They're well trained. They've all been to universities in China and Russia and the US and Australia and Europe. They speak 2 or 3 languages. And so there's a real change, a generational change occurring. And one can feel it on the ground here now, that it's happening. Although the general populace doesn't really feel it, I don't think, not yet, not really. But amongst government, amongst cadres, in business, in education, everybody can kind of feel that there's definitely a change going on. Things are becoming just more organized, better presented, messaging is better and everything else. Now, the trick, the sort of the genius of Hun Sen, a very, very demonized person by the West, has been to be able to balance the relationships. So with the United States and Europe, sort of colonial kind of era, Vietnam War era kind of relationships, and balance that with ASEAN and with China and with other small states. Now he's managed to do that, and Vietnam and Thailand as well, which are the sort of the 2 large medium powers that surround Cambodia. That in itself is quite an achievement. So there's a sort of semi-neutrality, or if you like, non-aligned status. And what one can see here is the change in terms of demand. Demand for garment exports, for example, to the US and Europe is dropping. And that means that the United States, for example, and Europe have less leverage over labor laws and all those sort of rules, the rules-based order kind of idea, to leverage changes in government, which were designed really to destabilize the government in some way. So that's basically coming to an end. And what we see is that the ASEAN and RCEP, and which includes China and Korea and Japan, becoming more and more active. So the outlook is much, much more towards ASEAN directly, RCEP more generally, and then the trend towards BRICS and the Belt and Road. And so as we're talking about currency, this move by Oriental Bank, for example, is not the only bank to have done this. But what's interesting about Oriental Bank is that it's a Malaysia, Cambodia, and that arrangement, Malaysia and Cambodia, is strengthening quite a lot. And so also with Thailand. And we can see that this is in relation to trying to stabilize the Gulf of Thailand. The Gulf of Thailand. And because, of course, the Americans are very unhappy about the access from Gulf of Thailand into the South China Sea. So they're very concerned about that. But once again, the government here has been able to balance that arrangement with Thailand and Malaysia. And that includes energy in the Gulf of Thailand, gas and oil and so forth. But most importantly is the development of trade around the Gulf of Thailand, the ports around the Gulf of Thailand. So that's what's sort of happening in Cambodia. But I'd just like to go back to something that Einar said on a much more macro point of view. And that is, there's also a feeling here about connecting, Cambodia is still a very small country. It's a lower middle income country, but it's developing its diplomatic network along the lines of the BRICS. So it's just opened a new embassy in, for example, in Brazil. It's active with all the other partners. It's got embassies in all the BRICS partners, but it only has 27 embassies, and they are still dominated by Europe and the US, basically, Australia, New Zealand, so forth. Sort of the Five Eyes, you might call it. But that is changing slowly, and I think what we're going to see is there's going to be embassies opening in Hungary and Serbia, Mexico, and other places, Morocco, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, etc. And that's the trend. That's definitely the trend, and I think that trend is going to be repeated in lots of smaller states, not micro states, but definitely in smaller states, and that's going to strengthen this whole operation. And of course, cross-border transactions, blockchain, and ledgers. This is something that the government here is very keen to do, but we're starting off a very low base. So we're just stepping into digitalization of all the records as a first step, and that's going to take about a year or so. So that's sort of what's going on, I think, not just in Cambodia, but it reflects what's going on in lots of small states around the world. They're all looking to that. They want to maintain some kind of balance and neutrality, as Einar said, and SL said. But the trend is definitely towards grouping, towards the non-aligned, towards BRICS, and utilizing the Belt and Road Network for all of the substructure of transport and ports and infrastructure and so forth, and the superstructure, which is what we're talking about, the superstructure of all of that, which is currencies, cross-border transactions, digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, not Bitcoin. And I think that is definitely the trend. But I would just say with one caveat, and that caveat is that the US and its allies are often just working on election cycles. And so the next election cycle in ASEAN is basically going to be 4 years from now, 3 to 4 years from now. That'll be the next election cycle. And I think if the Americans can make it through this election cycle of their own, they will revert to that habit, which means that they will then start doing more activities that are destabilizing for the region. And the view here is basically that the split is a maritime continental split that the US has always followed, basically peripheral maritime, and that they will just continue to do that. And so we've got a 3-year window to develop a stronger connection through all the BRICS networks and with the non-aligned people. And that's the kind of the view. And then we have to be prepared to strengthen our messages internationally, build those networks to be able to resist the next wave of election cycle interference.
We might come back to some of those issues if we've got time later on, but one of the recurring themes so far is this question of neutrality and its place in the emerging multipolar landscape. And there's no better a person than Pascal, who's spent his professional life deep in exploring what neutrality actually means, beyond being a nice sounding word. Pascal, finally, I get to cut you in on this conversation and to shed some light on, I guess, the broad sweep of the topics that have been covered so far, particularly from the point of view of the experiences of countries in their pursuit of neutrality, and perhaps how neutrality can play a role in the design of the institutions that we need for a peaceful multipolar world.
Well, thank you very much, Warwick, for putting all of this together and this discussion. This is extremely fruitful, and it for food of thought, but also then to actually communicate with others, because this is one of the problems that we are having. I mean, we all know the propaganda, right? And we all know we're suffering from something that it's kind of difficult to wrap our minds around it. And the only reason why I started my channel and also my academic concentration is that I'm trying to understand why is it that we are now living in a period that seems not to resemble the others. And yes, we are trying to take this in terms of, okay, power transition from the US to Asia, but the question to me is, how is it possible that we naturally have always coming up this tendency of certain countries to try to be neutral? And you can call it whatever you want, call it non-alignment, call it block free, whatever. I mean, there's various versions, but the basis is always the same, and it is that it doesn't make sense for countries to just follow along, right? You have different priorities, different needs. Therefore, if you want to get the most out of it, you need to have your own position. I keep saying being neutral doesn't mean you're standing in between. It's being the third part of a triangle, because you're having a relationship with all others. And the difficulty over the last couple of years has really been, why is it that in Europe we are losing so many neutrals, while in Asia, we see more of this neutralism arising, right? Naturally, and they don't call it like that, but Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy, Indonesia's strategy, India, where like the Indian foreign minister keeps saying, like, look, guys, we are not going to choose between you. We are 1.3 billion on this earth. We have a right to do our own thing. And the one thing that I came to is that neutrality and independence always depends on the structure of the international system. And what we are seeing right now is two opposing visions for the international system. One is the post-Cold War, or let's say the Cold War system, was two hierarchically structured pyramid systems, right? With two poles, and then you have downstream countries. That one pole broke away. We had then the United States, and we know that they tried to just build a large version of what they had with the institutions, right? The Soviet institutions, they left. The whole communist institutions that were trying to build, they left the stage. Now we have this Western liberal pyramid scheme, and in Europe the pyramid scheme still works, but it doesn't work in Asia, and we are seeing the alternative vision of that, which is multipolarity. That's what Russia and China and so on is working on. That's what we are seeing in the SCO. The whole talk is about being equal among each other, being a network, being distributed, even the monetary system with distributed ledger, right? You don't want to have the pyramid anymore. Now, in Europe, a lot of the formerly neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, the elites, they internalized the Western pyramid system, in which being a prime minister of Denmark, of Sweden, of Finland is not the highest position available anymore. In those systems, the highest position is NATO General Secretary, or in the EU, you can become foreign minister, and you can get the top post. And you can see how in that integration stream that we are losing a lot of countries who want still to do something independent, because the backbone of neutrality is wanting to be neutral, wanting to do your own thing. And we see how there's a group of people where the United States was extremely successful, and we must congratulate them for selling their vision to the local populations. They don't have to threaten the Europeans at gunpoint, as the Europeans did with the whole world during colonialism, that you either follow or we shoot you. They managed to sell the idea of just integrate with us and just be happy with it. And in Asia, we see that this didn't work, and we see that Southeast Asian countries want to do their own thing. ASEAN, one of the pillars of ASEAN still is the ZOPFAN, the Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, and that is going to continue. The question to me is Japan and South Korea. The thing is, Japan often looks as if though it's an Asian version of a European country, but in fact, under the hood, it doesn't work like that. In Japan, nationalism is still a very healthy thing, actually. So what to me is the question is, how are these different actors going to structure themselves, and are they going to be able to resist also this divide and conquer strategy, not of the United States per se, but of the ideology, right? Of the ideology of integration, and you can call it globalism, whatever you want. But this struggle now between these two different ways of structuring the world, either as a pyramid, hubs and spokes, or as a distributed network. That's what's going to go on. And I believe that the discussions about the systems that are being created will also largely depend on which one of the two models will be chosen. And it seems to me that the distributed network, has a very good chance now to break through, just because we have a lot of individual states, large and small, from Russia and China down to Cambodia and Laos and so on, who have something to gain within the vertical structure, not the pyramid scheme.
Yeah, you mentioned NATO there, Pascal, and it seems that, and I guess we started this conversation at the outset really with the NATO gathering in Washington next week, as the sort of second bookend, if you will. And I guess I wanted to bring in Jeff here because Jeff's actually done a podcast recently on the history, I guess, of NATO as an organization. And just from my own point of view, it seems to me that NATO embodies, if you will, institutionally and strategically, philosophically, and behaviorally, those aspects of that pyramid structure that you talked about, which reflects in the fact that its existence is dependent upon it having identified an adversary. Perhaps, Jeff, you could shed a little bit more light on that and correct me if I've been wrong.
Sure, Warwick. Yeah, I did this a video podcast on the history of NATO, and I talked about it as the tragical history of NATO as the Atlantic Dr. Faustus. And kind of what I meant by that is that NATO has always really been tempted by this idea that, you know, one power can sort of rule the world, it can have this sort of ultimate power. And in a way that sort of goes all the way back to, you know, Halford Mackinder's principles, let's say, of, you know, he who controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland, Russia. He who controls the heartland controls Eurasia. He who controls that's the world island, and he who controls the world island controls the world. And that sense of wanting to control the world through NATO, I think, has been there right from the beginning. The great historian John Darwin, who's a historian of, you know, the British Empire and empires more generally, really makes clear that when NATO is formed, it is formed at this crucial moment where an American system of world, it's kind of American world system, American empire, if you like, but an American world system is established in collaboration with the European powers, which were then not just European powers, they were, you know, global empires. The British Empire, the Dutch, the Portuguese, all these countries had major interests in the Indo-Pacific. And so that it was a kind of, right from the start, a sort of, I guess, if you like, a partnership between the European powers, particularly the British, and the Americans to exert global influence. And I think that connection between the Euro-Atlantic powers and the Indo-Pacific has actually always been there within NATO's history, and I guess it's sort of being restated, I guess, more forcefully today. But the interesting thing about that, I guess, is that whole idea that there is a unipolar world, or that one power can rule the world, is just a complete, it's an illusion. I think even in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, America was dominant, but it was by no means probably even as powerful or as dominant within the world as it was in 1949. I mean, economically and all the rest of it. And even then, the world was multipolar. Even back through the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, the world was multipolar. John Pang mentioned the Bandung Conference. You know, that's so critical to the history of the post 1945 world. idea of unipolarity, I think, a kind of an illusion that unfortunately America and NATO is very much clinging to, and not actually seeing the kind of real deep, unstoppable, I guess, historical changes that people have been talking about, that just the flow of people and resources and ideas and information and money, etc., around the world is just changing directions, and it just can't any longer be controlled out of Washington and London.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of
interestingly enough, I checked.
Sorry,
I checked that. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Long a little bit here. This idea that it's actually a mythology, I think, is an important one, because it seems at the moment that in the face of lack of success of imposing a unilateral mythology on the world is not leading to a reflection on whether in fact that's a viable view of the world, but it's leading to a doubling down in terms of the approach, namely that the approach to impose a unilateral outcome on the world isn't working simply because we haven't tried hard enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if we see that in the place where you started with, the presidential debate, that Joe Biden says America can do anything. I mean, it's an absurd idea. It's simply demonstrably contradicted by so many facts in the world right now. But it's almost as if the illusion of primacy needs to be maintained to keep the institutions of power going.
I often describe the experience of this this gap, if you will, between mythology, ambition, and reality as leading to something of a sense of a buyer's regret, namely that, take China, for example, the effort over the past few decades was explicitly to change or to shape China in a way that was either in America's image or which suited America's interests. Now, Jerry, you're on the ground. You've lived in China almost the entire period of China being in the WTO, which was this period of engagement with a view to transforming China. Now, China did transform in lots of ways, and you've experienced and watched that. What's the sort of view from the ground, if you will, in terms of not only the transformations that have taken place in China itself, but how the shape of the world around us is starting to emerge, and where China, from your observations, is starting to think about, I guess, what a concrete multipolarity begins to look like?
I think, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And if I wasn't on this, I would be watching this for sure, because there's a lot of great names in here. I'm feeling a little out of my depth amongst all of these luminaries. But one of the things I've noticed about China, and I've been here 20 years, and I came here before we had a bridge to Hong Kong, before we had a high-speed rail, before all of these infrastructure projects. I mean, I lived on the 19th floor, and I was, I think, the top floor of a building. And I think in my city, Zhongshan, I was the third or fourth tallest building, and it was 19 floors. Now that building is hidden, surrounded by. So what we're seeing is a massive, massive infrastructure. And what China is doing now is taking that out. And Ina made a great point that, you know, the islands are sinking into the climate change rising oceans. And someone from the US says, well, you need a couple of patrol boats. What China does is it says, well, you need a port to put them in. And that's what China is doing. That's the difference between the two sides of this particular coin. China is not trying to say, pick a side. Come and join us. They're trying to say, well, why don't we all work together? If you've got those patrol boats and you need, you know, you might have uranium and you need a port to get it out. You might have iron ore and you need a port to get it out. China is going to build that port because it wants that uranium, it wants that iron ore, and that's the way that China has dealt with this. As far as I'm aware, with the exception of Djibouti, which was under the United Nations. China hasn't opened an overseas base. It certainly isn't patrolling the shores between USA and its islands. It certainly isn't funding or supporting the Hawaiian separatists, who quite rightly have a cause. So there's a lot of things that China is not doing, and that's that, as we go back to the 5 pillars, the non-interference. It's doing what it says. It says what it does, and then it does what it says. And I think that's the big difference between this. China is not looking for a unipolar or a bipolar situation. It's looking for a situation where the rest of the world can all benefit and all rise all at the same time. And that would include America. China would be very happy to see America sign up to BRICS. And probably a lot of Americans, particularly the MAGA communists in America, would love to see something like capitalism with American characteristics. And it wouldn't look very much different to communism, socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I see that as the future, and I just hope that NATO sees that as the future. We look at the European Union, and I'm looking at the Eurasian Economic Union and saying, well, there's more hope there than there is in the European Union. There's more hope from the RCEP, the ASEAN, and BRICS than there is from expanding NATO. We expand these trade, and I think that's what China wants to do, expand these trade organizations rather than these military organizations. So that's how I see that. That's how I think China sees it from the ground.
The challenge with that worldview, though, is that it really rubs up against an outlook that seems to have shaped, as Pascal described, that hierarchical structure or that model of the world. David, again, you've spent a lot of your time in Washington, and what Jerry and others have described is a world that, from where I sit, would be seen as fundamentally challenging and arguably threatening to the Washington view of how the world should be ordered. What do you think the challenges are in terms of bridging that gap? Is it possible for these conceptual views of the world or the world ordering to be bridged? What are the barriers to that? And how do you think this set of contradictions might play out?
Well, I want to go back to just one point Jeff mentioned about Djibouti, because I spent time there when I was in Washington, so I spent a lot of time around that part of the world. And the presence of China in that port is a very, very, very small in comparison to what we have, or what Japan, even Japan has some presence over there. So the presence of the Chinese in the Djibouti wasn't about, providing some sort of a naval assets there. No, it was a very, very small, it's almost like you can say insignificant in comparison to what we have in other parts. So to go back to your question, Warwick, is the idea of that in Washington. A lot of people do not know that when you hear what the president of the United States says there, or says that, it's not the president that is saying, it's the hidden hand behind. There is a major power structure inside Washington. A lot of average Americans do not even know. They are not even aware of. And that entity is the one that is driving the ship behind the scenes. And when Biden says something, Biden is incompetent intellectually for him to even understand where things are headed. It's not him. It's the entity behind the scenes. And where the challenge that is going on right now on the global stage is we are not willing to accept the rise of another power that's gonna, I'm not saying it's gonna displace the US, it's gonna be on an equal footing. We're not willing to accept this reality. And that's part of where that challenge is. And the US will find any means to disrupt that flow. Well, we can say whatever we want, we can do whatever. The world is moving forward because the rest of the world is kind of got tired of us, for example, weaponizing the dollar, of us, for example, getting involved in endless conflicts when American citizens are struggling to make ends meet. We don't understand why the government is embarking on policies in far lands that have nothing to do with our interests. I mean, I was arguing back in 2004 when the conversation started about the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia didn't start in 2008 with Obama. It started back in 2004 when at that time cables were circulating. Well, we need to figure out the strategy to pivot to Asia. And some of us were asking the question, what are we going to Asia for? When we got enough issues to deal with here, right here at home. And fortunately, or sadly enough, that you got countries, and I'm going to name names here because I don't shy away from this. You got the likes of Japan, you got the likes of South Korea, Australia to a degree, Philippines, New Zealand now, that paving the way for that kind of the emergence of those conflicts in Asia that they don't understand. They're going to be burnt. And if they think that the US is going to come over and defend them, they are mistaken. Ukraine is a case in point. Kosovo was a case in point. Yeah, but we're all going to think we're going to learn from this. The challenge that I see that the US is going to have to deal with one way or another, it has to do with, and both SL and Einer mentioned this one about the financial aspect, because that's where the heart of power of the United States is. And the shift of this financial structure, and I feel comfortable calling it Bretton Woods 2, that we're going to resist that by any means, including conflict. And if we know anything about history, we know what happened when Thucydides described the theory, the theory that when an ascending power wants to replace a sitting power, a conflict will ensue. I hope that doesn't happen, but this is where I see things moving in that direction.
We're starting to see some of that play out in very concrete terms in Europe, of course. You mentioned the conflicts in Europe, and we're also seeing other manifestations of these disruptions, I guess. The election results in the European Union parliamentary elections a few weeks ago, the elections in France that happened earlier this week, and of course the elections in the UK that happened overnight. Arno, you've straddled, again, these worlds. You know, you're living in Asia, you've lived in China, you are French, you're on top of what's happening in the European space. What's your sort of reaction to sort of David's sweeping assessment of the dynamics at play, and what's happening in Europe, number one, and I include in Europe the UK, and what are the lessons that we can draw from that in terms of other theatres where the malign influences are perhaps less pronounced, specifically in Asia?
I think overall what we're seeing in Europe is the consequences of unipolarity, but on the life of people. So concretely, we're seeing, for instance, a lot of consequences from the Ukraine war with the energy crisis, inflation, and so on and so forth. But because of the media landscape in Europe, there is a fundamental misunderstanding by European citizens of the causes of that. And sadly, it's being blamed on a lot of red herring, like foreigners leaving, immigration and so on. I'm not saying that immigration might not be an issue. It is maybe mass immigration was to some extent a problem, but it's definitely not what's the main drivers behind a lot of the issues that Europeans are seeing in terms of their decreasing living standards, right? I think first and foremost, it is due to our increasing vassalization to the US, which results in, for instance, we don't have a single massive tech company that was created within the past 30 years. It's all absolutely dominated by American companies, which is very different in Asia. You have all those massive billion-dollar companies. They actually did a good job at retaining their sovereignty there. So so the question is, how can we change the state of play? I think in some European countries' DNA, diplomatic DNA, like France, we retain that kind of thinking. So, back to the 70th anniversary of the 5 principles, I was listening to Dominique de Villepin, and he very much understands that from his words. France's historical approach to diplomacy has always been to be in some way non-aligned, a bit like the Bandung principles. That was bit by bit lost, starting with President Sarkozy in I think it was 2008, 2009 when he rejoined NATO and so on. But in the DNA, in the mindset, in the muscle memory of the French diplomatic system, I think a lot of people still retain this kind of thinking. So I think, under the hood is still there. I think at some point it could resurge, but I think it will take some time, and it will take us making a lot of mistakes, with, for instance, going for Le Pen, or false solutions like this, for us to understand that those are not the solutions, and for us to finally, put our finger on the real issue, and drive Europe towards retaining its sovereignty. So in the short to medium term, I'm actually quite pessimistic, even very pessimistic. But I'm a hopeful, optimistic person. So I think in the longer run, we'll figure it out again.
Look, I wanted to, I guess, just leverage off that point that you made. I mean, it seems that we're consistently coming back to this idea of sovereignty. Without sovereignty, you end up being absorbed into a very hierarchical system. SL, India has had a long history through its role in the non-aligned movement, and more recently in some of the comments from Jaishankar about the emergence of multipolarity in the world. India will do what India is going to do, really emphasizing this idea that it's taking a strong sovereign position as far as its assessment of its interests are concerned. How do you see this playing out from an economic point of view? And ultimately, how do you think, and you mentioned earlier a hopeful optimism, I guess, about Prime Minister Modi reaching out with an olive branch to reconnect with China and to sort out some of those issues. What do you think we can look forward to over the next few years on that front?
I mean, it's really, it's, as I would say, that India is very bipolar. Okay. So on one hand, it has so much promise and future, and it's the economy is growing fast. And if you talk to some of the economists, like say Ray Dalio, they think that India is going to follow the path of what China did 20 years ago: rapid growth, urbanization, industrialization, FDI, and the exports and so on. But in the reality, since I'm on the ground, I see some of the major problems and the hurdles to that. So one of the big problems is the brain drain. So the smartest people in India, at the first chance they get the hell out of the country. Okay, so that's a big problem because you need smart people to fix the problems, to analyze the problem as a system. There's no systemic thinking in India because you need to approach it in the holistic manner, right? So you cannot have one person just focusing on manufacturing, one person just focusing on the trade, one person just focusing on the investments. No, so you need people who can think of it as a system with 50 different variables, right? And for that sort of thinking, we need people who go to the best the universities and study the MBA, the engineering, and all of that, and then they come together. But the problem here is the smartest people, they all run to the US or to the UK. So we have a brain drain. And then the second problem is those people who are very successful in the US, like the former the chief of the Central Bank of India, they come back and they just spew the IMF solutions or the philosophy. They go, yeah, well, you don't really need manufacturing. There's the global warming, so you don't need the manufacturing. And these people, they think they can just do services and stock market like the US and get rich. But that's only going to serve like 5-10% of the population, and that's not the way to grow. So there's going to be struggle, and one can, there are so many systemic and fundamental problems in terms of, like, say, the infrastructure, the electricity, the trains, for example, if you look at the freight trains in India, in 2024, the average speed of the freight train is like 20 kilometers per hour or something like that. It's just so, it's just so ridiculous. So how they're going to, because if you look at what they get all, they're excited about is like the flashy, the high-end projects. Okay, like they want to bring in the Tesla manufacturing, but they can't do the cheap car manufacturing. They want to do semiconductors, but like if I look around my home, all the small gadgets are all still made in China. So why do you want to do like fancy projects when you cannot do lamps and Wi-Fi routers and just the basic stuff, So,
yeah. Well, the fancy project be lots of small, not so fancy projects put together with a design finish. John, we've had discussions about these sorts of issues, and what seems very interesting to me is that the challenges in India that SL outlined in terms of those domestic struggles, the bipolarity in terms of mindsets and approaches, also seem to be similar in other parts of the Asian region. And I guess I'm sort of watching how Malaysia is seeking to navigate, again, these sorts of challenges and position itself for its own development, but also to play a role in regional multipolarity. How do you see this playing out from that perspective?
That's an excellent question. I think Malaysia is really quite characteristic. It's a kind of it's a great country to ask this question about. It's right in the middle in so many ways. So on the one hand, taking the cue from SL here, on the one hand, actually, like India, Malaysia is very, very well positioned to understand the principles for a multipolar world. As I said earlier, Malaysia is a founding member of ASEAN. We were there at the Bandung conference. And over the years, Malaysian foreign policy has quite faithfully reflected those principles. On that, India, formerly colonized, you have among the elite an inability to, to put it quite bluntly, there's a kind of, there's been this immense elite capture, ideological capture that has gone on. And particularly since the 90s, actually, since the dawn of the unipolar era. I mean, I speak of this as someone who was part of it. I'm old enough to have been part of this, and people still think in that framework. They have a real difficulty adjusting to a world, the multipolar world that really our own policy dreamt of. So I go back to this, to the importance of the 5 principles and the logic embedded in them, right? And connect the thought of sovereignty, which you, Warwick, brought up. And this is really important. This business about neutrality and non-alignment for Southeast Asians, and I dare say for the people of the global South, what it really boils down to is sovereignty. And to understand the ASEAN attachment to sovereignty, for example, and why it's important, you have to look at it in the context of colonial history. 80% of the world was under colonial domination. People forget that. And it's only really rather recently in history that this has been overcome. But we all know that post so-called independence, there was a neo-colonial order, some people call it. Whatever you call it, that sovereignty is not yet complete. You know, we've had the logic of the sort of League of Nations world order, and then of the UN Charter, the post-1945 order, but we're still living with the lingering legacy, the mindset, and the actual practice of the great power logic of international relations that overcame the world. It's not as if East Asia or the Middle East or the Indian Ocean did not have logics of international relations. It's not that we didn't have an East Asian international order that was not hegemonic in the same way that the current or the dying imperial order is. So I want to stand back, and we need to use the word imperialism. We need to talk about US empire. You know, it's almost as if it's impolite to talk about it, but I don't think we understand where we are without addressing this. You know, Warwick, I neglected to say this at the start. Thank you very much for organizing this, and it's such an immense honor to be with, you know, you guys. I mean, you're people I follow to learn from. You're all people I follow to learn from. But I want to stand back and address this question of, and we organize this, Warwick said, in order to, the prompt for this was NATO being about to meet, right, the next NATO summit, and declare a kind of global NATO. This has been coming. These guys are going to do this. And to us, this is absolutely insane. We've all been struggling with this, right? You know, when I read Arnaud's tweets, when I speak, listen to all of you guys, one word that keeps coming up is these people are insane. They are delusional. What the hell is going on? Why are they so stupid, right? For example, what, you know, and if we're interested in peace, it behooves us to have a kind of a theory of change, some broad conception. I'm not sure we can all agree on this here. You know, I heard Einar give his notion of this, but you need this macro view of what the hell is going on to have a notion of how, you know, our little contributions might have some impact, right? I think David talked about this idea. You think the president is in charge? Well, not really. Well, you know, we're really in the wake of this amazing debate. That could not be clearer. You have a senile person there, and then you ask yourself, these people have managed to deny this over these last 4 years when the rest of the world, all of us, anybody with a pulse can see that this guy is not there. You know, and all of a sudden, these guys all wake up to it. What the hell? These insiders seem to know less than us. Either that or they're massively lying. So then we are presented with two things. Either there's some kind of, you know, deep state, this kind of military industrial complex, this elite, whatever, some unified, coherent bunch of people running the show, or my sense of it, even worse, there isn't, it's not coherent. It's even worse. So that's the sort of danger that we're in now. Yeah.
Look, this deep sense, I guess, of an incomplete quest for rediscovering sovereignty, and it seems to be at the heart of this question in the end.
Absolutely.
And Pascal, one of the interesting things that you mentioned earlier is about this subsurface bubbling of a sense of Japanese nationalism. And I mean that with a small n, not the capital N version of nationalism. And how these sentiments sort of play out across all of these countries that are trying to find their way out of the shadow and to become themselves again. There you are, you know, in Japan, with a global perspective brought to you by your studies and your research and your background. I'd like to just pique your brains a little bit on how these nationalisms may be harnessed or may play a role in nation states rediscovering the sovereignty preconditions necessary for them to become functional parts of a multipolar world.
Well, thank you very much for that. And, you know, I'm very glad you picked me because I really need to add or to say, like, John, you're absolutely right. This is exactly the problem. And the fact that we all think that this is insane means nothing else but that we are actually on the same page. The problem why we think stuff is insane is that we have a different analysis of what is going on from some of the people who make these policies. They see the world in a different way. They understand it differently. They actually think Russia is the evil empire or China is an evil uprising hegemon in the waiting who's just about to swallow first Taiwan, then the Philippines, then Japan, and then the whole world. They think in those categories. And I think it is an insane way of viewing the world, but there is a good number of people who actually do. Now, we know that there's the others, the opportunists, the neocons, that they don't believe in all of that, but they know that it is useful to spin it that way. And one of the things is that the Western media environment has been extremely successful in spin. It's the most successful propaganda operation in the history of mankind. That's what we are living in, you know. The best propaganda is the one that you don't recognize as such. And there's a huge swath of people, I would say about 1 billion or 1.5 billion or so, who don't recognize it as what it is. Then there's others who are either don't watch it or do recognize it as that. But the problem is this analysis part, and I think that's what we are trying also to do with our channels, right? We try to correct the analysis about how politics and international politics is structuring of what is happening. And when that then I think connects to what you asked me, Warwick, because nationalism is a double-edged sword, and it can go very, very, very wrong. But the healthy version of it is when nations, when countries and groups of people who live together under one legal code. I think the legal code is the important thing, because the world is structured around 193, 200 different legal codes defined by geographical boundaries, right? When the people who live in there agree that it is important that they get the best out of it, or the most out of it, without hurting others and so on, and position themselves and strive after legitimate self-interests. And the United States has legitimate interests. The China has legitimate interests. Russia has legitimate interests. And the ones who understand these the best are the people who live there and then work and strive together to get that. And if you get to a moment when you have a stable global structure where these interests compete but don't destroy each other, then we get closer to the kind of world that I think most of us would want to see. Now, as long as the United States defines its interest as being able to pick the leaders in Beijing, in Moscow, in Kiev, in Brussels, it's difficult to get to that point, and that's why we speak about this imperialism of the US, right? That we kind of have an aversion to. The thing that gives me hope is that in Asia things don't work as they do in Europe, and I do think that a lot of countries over here are still very much also interested in actually delivering to their own populations in one way or another. and that we have certain agreements that are still universal. Let's not forget, for all the things that are changing, there are some things that everybody says, no, we are organizing around that. One is the United Nations. Russia, China, the SCO. Everybody said, no, the UN is the UN. This is the structure. The charter is the charter, and that's what we do. Even the United States, even though they try to shoot at the UN every once in a while, but they don't structurally undermine it the way that they structurally undermine, for example, the WTO. So we have certain principal agreements, and in these institutions, we can still work together. The Security Council, for all of its dysfunctions, it still works. They're still meeting there. There's still a value in all of this. And my hope then is that around these common structures, we get to a flatter Earth, away from the pyramid one. And ASEAN, for instance, is a wonderful example of how you can organize an international organization that doesn't have to integrate. Yes, it suffers of consensus issues, but in return, you don't get this manic view of having to dominate others, which I think is a great thing. And absolutely, colonialism and the colonialist experience is pivotal to understand these also ingrained differences of analysis of what is happening.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make, because it seems to me that not only do we have a sense of hierarchy in institutional terms, but we also have a way in which the world has been ordered conceptually in a hierarchical sense, namely that there is a sense of America's Asia, America's China, America's whoever. And perhaps what we mean in part when we talk about sovereignty is the ability for communities, nations, and civilizations to discover their own voices, and for others to allow those voices to be heard. Ina, this is something that you've thought a lot about, and you've been working a lot over the last probably 10 years, if not longer, on precisely this sort of issue. Any thoughts on that?
Well, no, after 10 years, I've just given up. No, look, we're at a stage where we're struggling to reestablish a Westphalian order. We're stuck right now with American exceptionalism on one side and a multipolar world, which is emerging on the other. And the only real solution is if the U.S. is in fact not the empire it was, and it cannot impose its will on the rest of the world, and that the charade that they play in Washington is simply about special interests getting what they want. I mean, our family was in, we built 28 submarines during World War II. We were a big deal. And I can tell you, from sitting around the dinner table watching, what happened. The sad thing about America is that the elites no longer trust the people. And you see that in the Supreme Court ruling that you come out saying basically you have an imperial presidency. It was evident in packing the court there. And why did this happen? Because Barry Goldwater lost an election. And at that point, the moneyed interests of the United States, the families, and in each state, there are a number of families who, in essence, control the political process. And I don't mean, direct control. What I mean is when they have an interest, if you're the major employer, you call up the governor, and the governor knows you because you gave him money, and you say, "Hey, listen, this is important for the state." And the governor says, "Yes, I agree completely." People often scratch their head and they look at America and they say, "Oh, these people are crazy." Yes, it's crazy because there is, as was pointed out by my colleague, there's no end game. It's just a series of win points for individuals put together into coalitions that can be sold to the public. After World War II, American elites said we can no longer trust Europe. Now, of course, being racist, we wouldn't even consider trusting people who weren't the right color. But we basically said Europe is, they always get us into trouble. 2 world wars. We have to take the responsibility and, prevent World War III by taking control and moving the world in the right direction. Our idea of the right direction was liberal democratic capitalism. We can't really define it. We don't practice it, but we certainly want everyone to follow it. This gave birth to this idea of American exceptionalism, which was refined there, just slightly after the Reagan administration by our friend, what's his name? Anyways, Japanese Fukuyama, and he's all about this, triumphalism. The wall has fallen. It had nothing to do with Reagan. He actually worked for my grandmother when she was on a board. She said he was just not very bright, nice guy, but she took me 2 months to convince her that the guy she knew was president of the United States, to give you an idea. But since then, there's this idea in Washington that you don't really want smart people. Look at what happened when you had somebody smart like Carter. I mean, he was incapable. He wouldn't listen. He wouldn't give in to the special interest. What kind of government is that? So American exceptionalism is really, it's become a religion in the United States. If we renounce it, think about it. If we said, look, American exceptionalism, that was the wrong thing. Look at all the things we have done in the past. Right? Domestically, we've screwed our own people. Internationally, we've screwed everybody else. To wake up someday and say, hey, listen, all that stuff we did, probably criminal, right? Because we had no justification for it anymore. So psychologically, it's very hard for us to give up this idea that we have not been acting at the behest of God or the greater good, but simply in our own interests, and that it hasn't worked out. So American exceptionalism has to go away. The question is, how do you get there? And how do we get to this kind of Westphalian moment without all the kind of bloodshed that led up to it in the 100 Years' War? And that's really the way I see this. We can talk about so many of the different parts, the symptoms of the problem. But in the end, unless America changes, we are heading towards more conflict. And part of that conflict, well, no, not part. Almost all conflicts that have arisen, and we know about conflict having, been in conflict for all but 15 years of our 248-year history, having troops in all but 3 nations, having stationed troops in all but 3 nations. If you look at Noriega, if you look at the Shah of Iran, you just go down the list of the different people. In Iraq, we had Saddam Hussein. All these people used to be on our payroll. We create our own monsters. And in essence, the biggest monster we've created in terms of our own hegemony has been Russia and China. Number 1 in resources, 11 time zones. Russia with China, which is right now it produces more than the next 9 countries combined in terms of manufacturing. There's a land border between them, so we can't interfere with that. This is really our greatest issue. Well, what we see is an existential threat to this American hegemony. And you're going to, this is why NATO is moving towards the East. It's not just to confront China. It is confront this, what we see as an axis of horrible countries, whether it's Iran, North Korea, whatever, anybody who's opposed to us, who joins us. Our problem is that the world is moving in a different direction. Everybody is vying to join BRICS. Everyone is trying to get into SCO. These are organizations, I remember, we do not have a single organization that anybody wants to be part of right now. And that should be quite telling. So where is this all leading to? I do believe that at some point we will change, but only in response to a fairly substantial crisis. I'm hoping that it will be only economic in nature, but it's quite possible that it will be kinetic.
Well, with a bit of luck, it won't be kinetic, but I think you can't just rely on luck. And perhaps this panel today is part of a reaction by what appears to be a small group of people. But one of the reasons why I was hopeful that this group of people would convene is because you've all worked tirelessly over quite a number of years to build a substantial network of audiences who are paying attention, who are concerned about the direction of the world and alternative framings and find pathways forward. And I know we've been on this call for a long time. I have no doubt that if we were all together somewhere in a restaurant or a bar, we could go on all night and all day. But perhaps I could just throw the final word to Pascal, who's been generous enough to host today's event, in terms of a bit of an outlook for what NATO is going to be doing next week, what some of the challenges we face as far as responding to that as individuals and as active global citizens and citizens in our own countries, and how it is that we can make contributions towards a non-kinetic response to the situation at hand. Pascal.
Well, thank you very much. And again, it's great to discuss together and also have together the opportunity to basically just show that no, we are not okay with what is happening, and all of us have our different ways of talking to audiences and the world out there. But every once in a while showing that we come together and no, we don't agree. And by the way, US, Switzerland, and Europe, you're not speaking for us. I mean, yes, you speak for some parts of the population, but we're not all on the same page. And by the way, Russia and China, we are the part of the West who would like to get along with you. And I think that is an important message, and it's something to keep in mind for ourselves, that we're not alone, even though it might feel like that every once in a while. And we also have the ability to build things. I mean, I think most of us have a realist view of the world, of what is happening, and there the question is what you can do and what you can't. What can we not do? We cannot just walk up to the President of the United States and say, change it. What can we do? We can open YouTube channels and talk to the world and actually tell people, look, this is a better way of looking at it. We can write and so on. So if every one of us in their own little world with their own abilities, we can all contribute. If enough of us do that, we might just change the course of this goddamn ship that is still headed for the iceberg, and we can see the iceberg, but we just need to yell a little bit louder back to the captain up there that, by the way, there's an iceberg coming, and we won't like it if we actually really hit it. What is going to happen with NATO, I don't know, but it is absolutely, to me, it's clear that they're going to announce global NATO in one way or another, NATO's pivot to Asia or NATO's cooperation. I do believe that while they can show unity and so on, it is going to be way more difficult to actually do that in the end. And it is a tough sell, a NATO in the Pacific, just because of the A, the name for them. And it is going to be, while the Japanese and the South Koreans and a couple of Philippines are probably going to like the support, building the operational capacity and so on. We all know that it will take years, and it's a difficult process. And I think what we can do is try to just sabotage it as much as we can and just say, like, no, we don't want NATO in Asia. It has been horrible enough over there. Please, Europeans, if you want to go kill yourself, do what you have been doing for the last 1,000 years, but we don't want it over here. We want to structure it differently. And I speak as a Swiss, but we're in Asia. and I think also we want to, again, save Asia and the world from this European mindset, which in the end it is that's taking over. And I think it's fair to just enunciate that in our own ways and with our own nuances, and also disagree, right? And then keep the discussion flowing. So I thank you all for taking the time, and let's communicate with people.
Thank you.
Wonderful, Pascal. Thanks very much. And look, thank you again, everybody, for making time at all sorts of crazy hours for some of you to join this first of what I hope will be, if not a regular panel discussion, but nonetheless a periodic one where we can join our forces and share our thinking. and through that, I guess, build stronger networks and a better understanding of what's going on in our world. I might just add one more thing before we wrap up, and that is that we've had some European friends who were not able to join us today because of time zone challenges, and perhaps that's something that we'll look at doing in the not too distant future, making sure that it is possible to hear voices directly from our friends and partners in Europe, and hopefully spread the message that there are other ways of ordering the world that is more peaceful and more prosperous. So once again, thank you very much.
Okay, Warwick, before we go, if I may, one thing. I have a project called Asian Narratives, and Warwick, you have it. How many people here have use Substack? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Arnaud, you do not have Substack?
No, I'm just on Twitter.
He
just
writes,
on Twitter.
He writes on Twitter as if he's writing for Substack.
Basically.
All right. I follow people on Substack. Yeah.
Yeah. The reason I say that is it's good for us to talk amongst ourselves, to share a diversity of opinions, but those opinions need to really go out to as many different people as possible. So Warwick, you have a project, Digby, you have a project, I have a project where, in essence, we're establishing channels. And I would like to invite you people to become writers. That means you just, if you feel like it, you can post whatever you have there. It's basically an intro. So it'll go back to wherever you want, whether it's your website or your Twitter feed or whatever. This is not an attempt to grab your audiences, simply to establish more channels so that people can hear these views, understand that there are a diversity of so many different nuanced views who are looking at this. And rather than, lumping it at all in, so you're panda huggers, or, you hate Europe and America. That's not the case at all. But we have to broaden our base a little bit, because the current media is not very friendly towards this. They want to simplify it down to you either love America or you're a communist baby eater. So I hope this will be received. I'll contact you individually. But I would encourage, especially on Warwick's side, Digby's, feel free to be on mine, but as many channels as possible to broadcast exactly what's being said here. I'm on so many different stations, but I feel very impotent, because I don't feel that the message gets out enough. And I do think that social media is probably the best bet for broadcasting these kind of views that I've heard today.
Right, thanks, Anna. Look, on that score, Pascal mentioned a little bit of technical housekeeping right at the outset, and I'm not sure if everybody was online at the time, and that is that YouTube does have an approach to content sharing, which would lead to potentially blocking the same content being broadcast through multiple channels. So the suggestion is obviously to add, when we share this particular panel session, to add your introduction to it, to position it in a way that makes sense for your communities and your audiences, and perhaps also to put a closer on it as well, so that there is a substantial difference, if you will, from a content point of view. But I guess the aim of this is to bring you all together. For me, it was to hear the different perspectives in one place, and to enable us to show the world that we're not islands, that we are connected, and that we can have meaningful conversations and exchanges about things that we care about in our own little version of multipolarity, right? And so if we can get those sorts of messages out and continue supporting each other in the cause of supporting multipolarity and peace and economic development for developing countries, then we're making a meaningful contribution. So look, thanks very much again. And we'll organize something again very soon. But Pascal, when this is ready, obviously, well, I'll leave it to you. You'll know exactly how to share all this stuff, and then we'll figure out how we go from there.
You will receive you receive a Dropbox link from me with the raw footage here as it was shot by me, and then you make out of it what you want. Repost as it is or so. I recommend to add a little something just to make sure YouTube doesn't. I mean, it has been fine mostly, but I've had a recent experience that was, well, anyhow, just a little modification somewhere will help to make it your own.
Wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Great meeting you guys.
Thank you.
You also.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a
Warwick.
great for 4th of July.
Enjoy.
Enjoy.
Bye.
Bye.
See you. Bye.